are. Let me put my map up here. Now, if you're wondering why college instructors are not dressed in a coat and tie or dressed very appropriately, if you were in my face-to-face class, I would not be dressed like this. I would have a tie on, a dress shirt, whatever. But I don't work in the summers. In fact, I'm on summer vacation. But I know that I have to prepare these lectures for you good folks, coming up in the fall semester here. So that's why I'm rather casual with this. All right, let's have a little refresher on what we went over the last time we were together. We were talking about the creation of colonies. And as we all know, in what would later be the United States, we're going to have 13 colonies. Last time we were together, I think we talked about the creation of Virginia. Then Maryland was the second one, Massachusetts. About that. We went on up into Connecticut and Rhode Island. I didn't tell you about this because I don't have a lot of information about this to give you. But I'll just tell you that the northern parts of Massachusetts separated and formed New Hampshire. So that gives us the 6 colonies that we have. So we have 7 to go, and we'll get through those 7 today here. Now, colonization in the American colonies is going to cease for about 25 to 30 years. And this is primarily due to a fact which is called the English Civil War. So let's take a look at my document screen here, and we'll see what we have. The English Civil War, and you need to recognize this now. Now, James I was King of England. He was a Stuart. He was James VI of Scotland, but he was King of England from 1603 until he died peacefully in his sleep in 1625. Sometimes he's referred to as the wisest fool in Christendom, homely but vain, idle but erudite. And James I always had problems with Parliament. Parliament was controlled largely by the Puritans, and James he was always trying to lecture Parliament and just tell them the way in which they properly should function. And when he died, James II was followed by his son, who was Charles. James I was followed by his son, Charles II. Charles II's reign would last from 1625 until 1649. He was no better than his dad. He always coming in conflict with Parliament. In fact, in the year 1629, Charles I dissolved Parliament, and they would stay not in session. They would be dissolved all the way until 1640. In the meantime, Charles I got into a conflict with Protestants, Puritans, Presbyterians that were in Scotland. He also came into conflict with Irish Catholic bandits in Ireland, and he had no other option except to call in Parliament. So he brought Parliament back into session, and immediately they passed a law saying the king could not dissolve Parliament. So the king, Charles I, sent in his personal guard to try to arrest all these Puritan parliamentary agitators, and they were able to escape. And what we're going to find here is that now we'll see 2 sides to form. One side which is supportive of the king, and these are wealthy English people, support the king, high church Anglicans and the Church of England, and they refer to themselves as Cavaliers. We had the other group, which was represented mostly by Puritans in Parliament, and they called themselves Roundheads. And the reason they referred to themselves as Roundheads because they had short haircuts, hence the name Roundheads, as opposed to the Cavaliers having largely powdered wigs, frosted wigs with that. And so anyway, the English War erupted here. If you travel through England and you try to find these battle sites, they're virtually all over England itself, so it's hard to pinpoint exactly where battlegrounds would stay, all concentrated anyway. And I think you have a included video that addresses that topic here. All right, now the leader of the Roundheads was that of Oliver Cromwell. I need you to recognize that name, Oliver Cromwell, and you'll see him again in the future here. And anyway, this war dragged on, and at first, during the first years of the war, the Cavaliers were always successful on the battlefield, it seemed. And then finally the Roundheads gained the upper hand. And then they ended up in 1846 that Charles I and the Cavaliers actually surrendered. So they gave up. And that should have been the end of it. Charles I probably would have retained his throne, and that would have been the end of it. But unfortunately for the Roundheads, under Cromwell, they began to argue. They began to bicker a little bit, and Charles I, very, very unwisely, chose that as an opportunity to restart the war. It's the worst nightmare that he'll ever have. And when the war resumed, that's when Cromwell made his statement, "I will cut off the king's head with a crown attached to it." And so nevertheless here, the Cavaliers once again surrendered here in 1648. And the king was placed on trial. This is Charles I, was placed on trial, tried for treason, and of course the outcome is going to be obvious, and he was found to be guilty. And so on my birthday in 1649, Charles I went to the gallows, if you will, if you want to call it that, and he was beheaded. He was beheaded. This was right outside of number 10 Downing Street, not very far from where the Houses of Parliament are present today. So Oliver Cromwell, I didn't write the dates down here, Oliver Cromwell will now become the Lord Commander, if you will, of England. And Cromwell was serving that position from 1649 until he died in 1658. All right. So anyway, after the death, and no colonization took place in that time here. Lord Protector is the word I was looking for a second ago. So after this, in 1660, Charles II, and Charles II, who was a brother, was a son of Charles I, Charles II had been in exile. Now, you might suspect here, he's going to be very cooperative with Parliament. He knows what happened to his dad. He wants to be very cooperative with them. And so the relationship between Parliament and the King is not too unpleasant with that. Sometimes Charles II is referred to as the enemy of chastity and virginity. He had no royal children. He had many unroyal children. All right, so that's Charles II. So under Charles II in 1660, we start seeing the colonization efforts to resume here. For example, here we have Carolina. Carolina is a Latinized name for Charles. So Charles II was so vain, he's going to allow these colonies, the colony of Carolina, to be named for himself. And this was established here. It was, let's see if I did not write any names down here, but this was largely under the influence of 8 court favors, to include one of his friends, Lord Ashley Cooper. Today, if you go to the principal city in Carolina, South Carolina, which is Charleston, you'll find it's in the confluence of the Ashley River and the Cooper River here. Okay, so anyway, we got a colony that is established there, which is Carolina. That's our 7th colony. And in 1682, I believe it was, the town, and the wonderful town, a very southern town, which is Charlestown. So this is a town that is named for Charles II, and later the name would be corrupted, I don't know if you can read this, to Charleston rather than Charlestown itself. Unfortunately, within the Carolinas, there were too strong of differences that developed between the northern parts and the Albemarle backcountry people, and the southern part where we had the aristocracy and wealth. And the differences were so great that in 1729, the two colonies separated, and 2 areas separated, and it formed North Carolina and South Carolina. So that brings us up to an additional colony here of North Carolina and South Carolina. All right, so let's move on a little bit, and let's see what else we're going to see here as we continue our colonization effort. And I'm going to have to quit writing in the red because the red just doesn't show very well. But in 1664, the brother of Charles II, who was James, and James, Duke of York, and James, Duke of York, granted a charter to establish a colony, and this colony would be where the Dutch colony was, and the one that had been established, if you will, the settlement had been established by, what's his name, Henry. And I'm sorry, that slipped out of my mind right there. So, never Henry Hudson. And nevertheless, here in 1664, James, Duke of York, dispatched Richard Nichols to sail up the Hudson River, or the North River, as we call it anyway, and forcibly took this from the Dutch, and naming this colony here for James, Duke of York. You know the name of it. We're going to call this colony New York. So that brings about a different colony, an additional colony to this. All right, so let's move on. And once again, we're going to find James, Duke of York will grant to 2 of his friends, one person by the name of Sir George Carteret, another by the name of Sir John Berkeley, that's Berkeley, the authority to establish another colony, which would be south of New York and the Hudson River and the Delaware River. And the thing about it is that for Carteret had been born in the Jersey Islands off the coast of England. So how appropriate would this be to name this colony New Jersey? So that gives us another colony. And if you're a little bit challenged on United States geography, you may want to get a map out and determine where these sources are, where these locations are. All right, so that gives us another colony here. All right, so let's go over to England. And when we arrive in England, there's a group of individuals that give themselves the name the Society of Friends. They're very, very peaceful individuals. In fact, they're pacifists. They're a little bit unusual here. They believe that everybody has the inner light, and the inner light which will move you along to righteousness here. In church services, there are no ministers. Males and females have equal parts and equal places. They have equality. And people speak when the inner light moves them. They use odd language in our vocabulary like thee and thou, and they do not take oaths. Jesus said, do not swear, so they won't take an oath. They refuse to doff their hats to social superiors, and they were just a different group of people here. And when the Lord's name was spoken, they would tremble. They would quake. And by now you've probably figured out what we call this group. Another name for them, these are the Quakers. And the Quakers were being persecuted because of their religious beliefs. And what they needed was religious sanctuary. And sure enough, they had purchased some land in New Jersey, but they were looking for something else. And entering into our focus here is an individual by the name of William Penn. William Penn was an Englishman. He was a member of the Society of Friends. He was sympathetic to them. And fortunately for William Penn, he had a father, and his father was a very wealthy Royal Navy admiral. And it just so happened that the King, Charles II, owed a huge debt to the Royal Navy admiral, who was the father of William Penn. Well, William Penn's father passed away, so the inheritance went to William Penn. And to try to liquidate this debt that Charles II, the king, had, he offered William Penn a large amount of land between New York and Maryland that was larger than the size of England itself in exchange for that debt. And William Penn accepted that deal. And of course, the offer included this colony, this area would be named for the Penn family. And you know what I'm talking about with that. We get another colony established, which is known as Pennsylvania. All right, it's a nice area to visit here in 1682. The city of Philadelphia, I was going to call it the beautiful city of Philadelphia, but I kind of hesitate to do so. If you go into the old historic area of Philadelphia, quite beautiful there. But if you get outside of the old city, it's you're actually placing your life in danger to get outside of the central city here. If you look at the word Philadelphia, and I've already told you I have a fascination with words here. If you look at the word Delpho or Delphia, it means brother. And if we look at the word root philia, such as pedophilia, necrophilia, it means to love. You put it all together, we get the city of brotherly love here. All right, in 1703, the three southern counties of Pennsylvania separated from Pennsylvania, and they created their own colony, which is called Delaware. So that brings us up to 12 colonies here. And so adding to the 6 that we had and going back today, we got North Carolina, South Carolina, we had New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania. And did I miss one there? And I think I've got all of those. So that brings us up to 12 colonies. All right, so anyway, let's continue with this. And let me see where I am here. And in 1732, a charter was granted. You can't read this. And let's see if I can darken this a little bit. There it goes. And a charter was granted by the English king, George II. All right, now George II served as king 1714, throughout this period anyway, 1744, I believe it was anyway. And George the King granted this charter to General James Oglethorpe. Let's see if I have a likeness here of James Oglethorpe. This is in your textbook, by the way, but this is what he looked like here. And, of course, we're going to obviously name this for the king, and this colony will be known as Georgia. All right, now, at first, when James Oglethorpe established this colony, he was hoping to create silk manufacturing, wine manufacturing. African slaves and African free laborers were not allowed in the area of Georgia, but things did not work out in the way which Oglethorpe had planned, and it ended up instead of being wine and being wine and silk, they ended up going mostly to other crops there, such as rice. Anyway, as it turned out here, we had about half of Georgia's population that would be slaves, and many of these slaves were actually Native Americans instead of African Americans too. All right, so that gives us another colony that's established. Okay, now let's address a different topic here, and this is kind of a fun topic. When the enemy of virginity and chastity, Charles II, died in 1685, he was followed by his son, James, Duke of York. And James, Duke of York, will take the title here, James II. You got to remember now that James II is the son of Charles I. So he knows exactly what happened to his beheaded father here. Now, James II was a Catholic. Now, this is in England. Now, James II is a Catholic. This is not a good recipe because only 2% of the English population is Catholic. And the remainder of that is Church of England, or they're Puritans, they're Protestants for that, you know. So anyway, James II had 2 daughters, and had a daughter whose name was Mary, and a daughter whose name was Anne. I'll just mention Anne very briefly here. She would later be Queen Anne. But Queen Anne, she was Protestant, and she was married to just a pathetic drunk by the name of George. Now, Mary, who was Protestant, and the other daughter of James, is married to her cousin, who is William. Now, William is the leader of the Netherlands. He's William III of Orange, and he's the leader of the Netherlands. And then, strangely enough here, when James II, he knows that if he dies, then his throne will go to Mary, who's the older daughter, or subsequently to Anne, who are both Protestants, and James II is Catholic. So anyway, crazily enough, and this did happen here, suddenly here in 1688, a chamber lady came in carrying a little baby wrapped in a blanket, and she said, "Sire, here's your son." And she presented to James II his son, and he promptly christened the son a Catholic. So now the rules change, so that if something happens in the life of James II, his son, James Francis Edward Stuart, the little boy, will now become king, and he is Catholic. Well, it didn't take much for everybody to see through this. And so, nevertheless here, 7 English lords, both Tories and Whigs, went to the Netherlands, and they pleaded with William, and remember, William is the son-in-law to James II, to send the Dutch army, and send this Dutch army over to England. And sure enough, he does send this army into England, and the Dutch army lands in an area which is called Torbay on the southern English coast, and the army started marching towards London. Don't forget what happened to the father of James II, who was Charles I, who was beheaded here. And so James II sent out an English army. So I'll use my hands to demonstrate this. And now we have the English army coming in this direction, and the Dutch army coming in this direction. And what happened here is when the two armies met, the English army sided with the Dutch army, all heading back towards London. And I ask you, if you were James II, what would you do? And you would probably flee, and that's exactly what he did. And he fled the country. He went down to the English coastline, and not to make this a long story, but got in a fishing boat and actually made his escape over to France. And that's where he'll spend virtually the remainder of his life, and he'll die in France. So if you're wondering who might become the new sovereign leaders here of England, it is William and Mary. So it's William III of Orange and Mary II. Good leaders, and very good leaders here. And with this, we're going to find a lot of stability that will take place in England. And where there have been some rumors of separation from England in the 13 colonies, now those rumors just slowly quelled. All right, so we brought about a lot of stability with that. All right, now that completes that chapter here, which is chapter 2. And I want to go into chapter 3 in your textbook, which deals with society and culture and provincial America. If you're following the textbook, I'm on about page 66 and 67. And what I want to do here, I want to make a comparison between the North and the South. I'm talking about New England and the Chesapeake region. The Chesapeake would be Maryland and Virginia with that. Now, I want to point out to you that the societies in America were much different than that of the cultures that we had in England. In England, you had English people, and they spoke English. And if you went to American colonies, what groups of people did you have? And you had a wide variety of people here in the American colonies. You can only imagine. We had Spanish, we had French, we had Swiss, we had people of Germanic descent, you had Scots, you had Welsh, you had Irish, and we could just go on and on and on with this. And what England was doing, they were taking prisoners of war and criminals that were from Ireland and from Scotland and just sending boatloads of them over to the American colonies and just dumping them here. So it was a very, very unsophisticated society here. And you got to realize that in England has a lot of people in a small amount of territory. And if we go to the American colonies, we have a small amount of people in a large amount of territory there. So completely different with that. The English that were in the American colonies were very, very unsophisticated. All right, here. It is estimated that probably 75% of the individuals that were in the English colonies were indentured servants, where they would indenture themselves for a period of time to get passage paid for them on a ship to bring them over to the New World here. So very different. So let's take a comparison here between these two areas, New England, and imagine in your mind, New England and Chesapeake. And if you were in my face-to-face class, I would be asking you right now, where do you think the life expectancy would be the longest here? Where would the life expectancy be the longest? Would it be in New England, or would you be in the Chesapeake? And the vast majority of my students always answer Chesapeake. And you'd be very surprised with that. It's not that way at all. And the New England community, the life expectancy was about 70 to 71, which is remarkably high for the years, say, 1760, something like that. And oh, by the way, the population in the colonies by now has risen all the way up from 250,000 to 2.7 million here. So it's a lot of people. But nonetheless, the life expectancy is much greater in New England than it is in Chesapeake. Here's a magic word I want you to consider here in the Chesapeake, where it is very swampy, such as Jamestown here, malaria. And malaria was just devastating to these two areas here. In New England, you would expect to find maybe 6 to 8 children in a household. And in Chesapeake, you would find maybe 2 children in the household, which seems so unlikely here. In the Chesapeake area, for 25% of the children that were born, they died in childbirth. 50% of the children in the Chesapeake died before your age, died before the age of 20 years of age, primarily due to that of malaria. In the Chesapeake, we had a high sex ratio. There was always many more males than there were females in the Chesapeake here. Women would marry early, many men never married. Women would marry early, their husbands would die, and the women would always marry again, the husband would die, the women would always marry again. And this kept it very difficult to maintain a family unit with that. Some children never even knew who their fathers were, maybe like today, I don't know. That was an unkind thing to say. In New England, you had a more even sex ratio, about as many males as you had females. So this allowed you to form family units with that. 6 to 8 children. In the Chesapeake, you had 6 to 8 children, but 6 children would die, such as that, too. All right, in New England, you formed a more tightly knit family unit with that. Much more emphasis placed on religion in that area, too. Puritanism was a major religion. It was not unusual in New England to find little girls' names such as Prudence, Patience, Chastity, Comfort, completely different with that. All right, so let's move on a little bit. And I want to talk to you about the Southern economy. All right, so here's the Southern economy. And I know, and I would ask my class this, what do you think the number one cash crop is in the South? And inevitably, many of my students will say that it's cotton. And that's a wrong answer here, folks. Cotton is not even a cash crop in the South at this time. We're going to have to wait a number of years before we do make cotton the principal cash crop. So the principal cash crop in the South was primarily tobacco, rice, a little bit in the way of sugar cane. Tobacco depletes the soil very rapidly, so eventually we'll find that much of the tobacco growing area will be replaced by wheat. One interesting aspect of this lady, and I wish you'd remember her name, Eliza Lucas. She was from Antigua. Antigua is a Caribbean island, it's an English Caribbean island. And she introduced a new crop which would add to the southern agriculture. This was called indigo. Indigo would not compete with rice. It could grow on higher ground there. And if you're not familiar with indigo, it produces a blue dye. So anyway, that's the southern economy there. All right, so let's take a look at the northern economy and see how it compares here. The northern economy. Not too different than today. What little industry we had in the colonies, it was present in the north, but we didn't have very much anyway. But livestock, corn, apples, and I don't know if any of you traveled in the north. Most of you probably traveled in Florida anyway. And you know, in Florida, if you're traveling in southern parts of Florida, you just see orange orchards just miles and miles as far as the eye can see. You see oranges. Well, if you go to the north, and I'm talking about areas such as Ohio, Pennsylvania, as far as the eye can see, you see apple orchards there. And it was a big, big plus in the northern economy here. All right, now, another unique trade development, you can find this in your textbook in Chapter 3 that took place, is called the triangular trade. And it's very, very complex, and I've tried to make it much more brief to you. But let's see, open your minds a little bit, and let's see if you can identify this. And where I want to start this, I want to start this with New England. Now, in New England, you had distilleries, and these distilleries manufacture rum. They manufacture rum. We have other goods that are manufactured in New England, and then these goods are shipped to Africa. They're shipped by boat and they're shipped to Africa. And that's where they're sold, that's where they're exchanged. And now watch what happens next in the second leg of this triangular trade, is that African slaves, and eventually there would be 11 million African slaves, plus gold dust, are going to enter into what is called the Middle Passage. And the Middle Passage, in which slaves are placed on ships, slave ships, and sent over to the West Indies. All right, now the West Indies, that's of course where the Caribbean is located, in the West Indies. And there they are sold. Now, for these slaves, the slaves in turn work on the sugarcane plantations to manufacture sugar and molasses. Sugar and molasses in turn is shipped from the West Indies and is shipped up here to New England. And what I would ask you in class here, what do we do with sugar and molasses? And sugar and molasses is used in distilleries to manufacture, where is it here, manufacture rum. Just a neat little triangular trade, much more complex than what I've done in my simplified version of it here. And if you're following your textbook, you can find it is much more elaborate than what I have placed here. All right, now let's go back to the South for a second. And we've all heard this term before. The South is recognized for plantations. And I would say only a small percentage of the population, actually did engage in constructing these plantations. Some were enormously large. One, for example, by Charles Carroll in Memphis, Charles Carroll in Maryland, had 40,000 acres, 285 slaves. And that was certainly the exception here. And in these areas, you would find the plantation would be its own sustaining community. There'd be a church there, you'd have stores there, schools would be present there. It's just like one community there on these plantations. All right. Now, in the north, it developed considerably different, much more religious here in the north, and it was not unusual to have covenants to form in New England. These covenants were formed. Very religious here, and I'll try to draw this for you. It's easier when I actually draw it and show it to the class and draw it on my dry erase board. But what the community would do, the community would develop around a commons area. And that's what this is. We'll say it's a commons area. Maybe it's 40 acres, maybe it's 80 acres, and there's nothing but pasture. And then cattle will be grazed out in this area. Maybe you can grow your crops out in this area too. And then the first family will designate their land such as this, the second family here, the third family such as here, the fourth family here, and then all of their cattle are grazed out here in the commons area. So it grows up around that pasture area. Today, if you visit some towns such as Boston, Massachusetts, if you go into the old town there, very popular gathering place is out of Boston Commons. And that's what I was talking about, where these communities were developed around these pasture commons areas. All right, so let's move on a little bit. And I want to take you to a period of time, which is a very strange and unusual period of time. And it will, I'm showing you the dates here of 1680 to 1692, and it was just a phenomena of mass hysteria in our country. Now, it was preceded about 100 years earlier by the same phenomena in England. And the phenomenon I'm talking about here, which occurred in many cities, but in Salem, Massachusetts, and like I'll say again, which is just widespread human mass hysteria. I'm sure by now you know what I'm talking about, and I'm talking about these witch trials. All right, let's see if I can get this properly here. And when you travel to the Boston area, let's see if I can get it up here far enough. If we look at our map, refresh your memory here, we had Provincetown, we had Plymouth, up here was Boston. And if you want to see where Salem is located, Salem is, I'm reading upside down, here's Salem in this position right here. And where it actually took place was over in Danvers Village here, and many of the other little communities, but this is the one, Danvers Village in Salem, where it's so closely recognized, where this human mass hysteria took place with witch trials. All right, and with these witches, they were identified as social outcasts. These were usually women, maybe a little bit older, maybe women that didn't go to church, maybe women that were divorced, or females that had never been married, lived on the outskirts of town, and were just a little bit odd with that. And of course, many of them were accused of witchcraft here. 19 Salem residents, females, were put to death before the trials ended in 1692 here. 8 others died in jail. 1 man was actually pressed to death because he refused to testify against his own wife. The trials came to a sudden stop in 1692 when the chief judge's wife was accused of practicing witchcraft, and for the judge, he said, enough of this nonsense. So anyway, and that put a stop to it here. Now, when you're traveling in that area today in Salem, the entire town is built up about this phenomena of the witchcraft there. You may take the time to visit the Witch Dungeon Museum. You can visit the Salem Witch Museum, and these museums are just all over the place in this very crowded city here. Go to the Salem Wax Museum if you wish to do. I have better things to do with my hard-earned money than use it in that fashion here. All right, so let's continue on a little bit. Now, religion at this time was of 2 types. We have the traditional, found this in the north and also in the south here, traditional, with an emphasis on a personal God. You know, a thinking man is Satan's best friend, that kind of attitude. And then we had the Enlightenment, and the Enlightenment, which was associated with science and reason. Better educated individuals by and large. You do not have to ask God for guidance. You have the mental ability to know right and wrong yourself with the Enlightenment here. All right, and strangely enough here, in the 1730s, it ended very abruptly in the 1740s, I won't say a hysteria, but a great awakening took place in which people began to go to church. And they went to church in great numbers here. It was just spread across the colonies here like wildfire here in this great awakening. It was America's first period of spiritual revivalism. And I want you to recognize that, because I'm going to ask you that of you on your first example. What is America's first period of spiritual revivalism? It's called the Great Awakening. And some noteworthy people associated with that, John Charles Wesley, they introduced a new, I didn't write it down here, they introduced a new religious faith which was called Methodism. So you'll need to write that down, Methodism. These are the creators of the religion, Methodism, John and Charles Wesley. If you attend the Methodist Church, you're very familiar with this. You have the Wesley Hymnal, the Wesley Foundation, John Charles Wesley. Everybody recognizes them. They were brothers from England. In fact, here's a likeness here of John Wesley here. This is right outside of St. Paul's Cathedral, present in London, England itself. All right. Okay, so let's take a few seconds here and talk about education. And a common type of education, particularly for that of elementary age children, was what is called a dame school. All right, a dame school. And this is where widows or unmarried girls will teach elementary children in their own homes. And I'm talking about in the home of the teacher there. All right. And you can read in your textbook here, I'm running out of time here, folks, but you can read in your textbook there about the Dame School Primer. I always read that to my class. I always find it to be kind of touching there, too. All right, now we're likewise going to see the emergence of some major institutions of higher education. If you were in class, I would list for about 6, 7, 8 of these, but I'm only going to list a few. Our first recognized major college in our country was Harvard, established by John Harvard, located in Boston, Massachusetts. Our next major institution was the College of William and Mary, which is in Williamsburg, Virginia today. 1701, Elihu Yale, established Yale, and New Haven, Connecticut. 1746, the College of New Jersey, which would later be Princeton, was established. 1754, King's College, which was later Columbia, named Columbia, would be established. We also had 1760, College of Rhode Island, which was Brown University. 1760, Queens College, now recognized as Rutgers. 1760, Dartmouth was established, still recognized as Dartmouth. Around that same period of time, the College of Philadelphia was established. The College of Philadelphia, which is recognized as the University of Pennsylvania today. Alrighty, my friends, we completed Chapter 2. We've completed the 13 colonies. We also went through the demographics, if you will, and life, the Great Awakening, colleges, education, and Chapter 3. So anyway, we're going to stop for the time being. We are moving well ahead here, folks. Stay up with your material now. Okay? All right, thank you.